Hi everybody, welcome to the next talk in the brilliant series of Queen Mary conversations, and this one is a conversation on the undead, which is a particular subject very close to my heart. We'll be talking here from about 7:30 till 8:45. And I'll introduce the different speakers as we go on. But it's so nice for you all to join us. The numbers are going up, and so maybe we'll hold on before really kicking off properly for just another 30 seconds or a minute to see if a few more people join us. But just to say that many of you have probably come from other conversations that have happened, and there are more happening tomorrow and on Friday as well. So please join those. Some brilliant conversations coming up on the art of teeth, on boxing in the East End, and a range of other subjects, bringing together artists, scholars, thinkers, speakers from different kinds of perspectives to talk around specific subjects. It's really fantastic and exciting array of different talks put together by Aoife Monks. So we're just going to wait, getting up now towards 50 people, so we'll start in a second. Right. All right, let's just kick off. My name is Martin O'Brien. I'm an artist and lecturer in theatre and performance at Queen Mary University of London. I'll be chairing and sort of speaking as an artist in this panel as well, so I've got sort of double foot, and I'm joined by Jane Wildgoose. I'm so excited to have a conversation with Jane, and Genna Gardini, who I know, and it's just amazing that you joined us as well, Jenna. So it's going to be a really fantastic conversation. The structure of this hour and 15 minutes will be a short introduction, about 5 to 10 minutes from me, just to sort of give a context to this idea of the undead. And then each of us will speak from our own perspectives about our own practices in relation to that idea. And each of us will talk about our own practice for, again, about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll go into a conversation between the three of us, and then finally open up for questions from the audience. But if you do have any questions during the conversation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function, which you can probably find if you hover your mouse down at the bottom of the screen. There's a little button that says Q&A, and you can click on that. It'll bring up a box, and you can type your question in there, and just put those in at any point, and we'll address them when we get to the end of the conversation. And there'll be a kind of mixture of, as I say, conversations and read sections. So just to sort of introduce the idea, I wanted to read you a short introduction that I'd prepared for tonight's event. And as part of that, I'll introduce Jane and Jenna properly. So I'll start with a wee anecdote, which I really love to do. Maybe about 2 years ago, one of my big passions, as well as the undead, my other big passion is sharks. And so I went with my friend and his 2 wee kids to see a series of plastinated sea creatures that were being shown in central London. And as we were going in and around, I was talking to these little kids. They're about 5, I guess. And we're talking, and we're talking about the sharks. They were asking me about the sharks. I was telling them about all the different species. And then we got to this point. I don't know how we got on to the idea of zombies, but we somehow got onto the idea of zombies. And one of the kids said to me, well, I think the scariest monsters of all are zombies, because they're both dead and alive at the same time. I said, oh, wow, so we've got a wee philosopher here. I said, yeah, that's true. I mean, that's the sort of fundamental fear of the human, that we occupy both the living and the dead. It seems to speak to those who have passed away, who have gone, but also echoes our own kind of sense of mortality. The kid just looked at me and went, yeah, just scary. But who or what are the undead? Sort of accustomed to the different varieties of creatures once human represented in the horror film. The coffin opens and Count Dracula emerges. Dr. Frankenstein pulls the lever and the creature made from parts of human corpses comes to life. The dead rise, rotting flesh and all, from their graves and stagger through the world. The spirits of the dead living on inside houses occupied by humans. Bandage-clad corpses climb out of the tombs, hauntings, huntings, apocalypses, visitations. The undead thrive in our landscape of pop cultural horror. But for me, The undead are not simply a fear-inducing thrill. They can be taken seriously as a way of understanding our relationship to life and to death. Richard Green and Silan Mohammed have said of the word the undead, its double negative construction, the grammatical negative of un and the metaphysical negative of dead. The idea of undeath problematizes our everyday notions of what it means to be alive in the first place. In a literal sense, we are all, as living beings, undead. It's only a short step from this to the suggestion that the state of non-death, otherwise known as life, that we privilege as authentic might itself be subject to the same doubts that attend our apprehension of undeath. And this we can kind of see an emerging interdisciplinary sort of subject area being known as zombie studies. It's kind of problematic in some ways, but useful in some ways. So the term zombie, spelled Z-O-M-B-I-E, sort of comes out of the Romero movies in the Hollywood tradition, and it's the version of the undead that feasts on the human flesh or brains, and on the kind of classic horror trope. But it comes from the word zombie, Z-O-M-B-I, so without the E, which is part of the Haitian voodoo religion, and that's probably comes from the Creole word, or the Creole term zobi, Z-O-B-I, which in turn comes from the Kimbundu term unzumbe, meaning ghost or a spirit of a dead person. So the kind of etymology of language that's come to be this sort of living corpse that we know and love so well today. And more recently, in TV and movies, we've started to see a shift in the terms that we use to talk about zombies. So walkers, for example, in one of my favorite TV shows, The Walking Dead, the partially deceased, which is one of my favorite terms for talking about them, biters, an array of other ones as well. And as part of this intro, I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of when Aoife asked me to do this, where it kind of comes from in my own practice and research and thinking. So I have cystic fibrosis, which is a life-shortening disease. And growing up with cystic fibrosis means a constant facing of your own mortality. My older cousin died from the disease aged 12 when I was 8. This was the first time I understood death as part of life. This was the first time I knew that I would not live to see my hair turn grey. This was the first time I began to understand the existence and temporality under the conditions of disease. The life expectancy for someone born in 1987 with CF, which is when I was born, is 30 years old. This information was plastered all over the charity appeals for the CF Trust. I was sure I would die at 30. Temporal movement towards that age was the defining condition of growing up for me. Death was an obsession. I reached and surpassed 30. Death did not come for me. In attempting to understand what it means to live longer than expected, I formulated the idea or the notion of zombie time. This is the temporal experience of living on when death was supposed to have happened. Zombie time's a different relationship to death and life. It's the form of enduring life when death is no longer the certainty it once was. It's no longer linear, it's full of breaks and ambushes. In zombie time, you keep moving, but not towards anything, just for the sake of moving. No goals, only desires, no plans, only reactions. The only constant is the presence of death, but not in the way it once was. But the zombie knows death and breathes in death. Death is in me instead of somewhere else. So it became a way of conceptualizing a sort of shift in relationship to mortality. The temporal experience of moving towards this sort of death date vanished, and instead, zombie time insists on a different temporal proximity to death. Like the Hollywood zombie, which holds within it a paradox and is both dead and alive, those of us living in zombie time experience death as embodied in life. We had come to terms with the fact that we were about to die, then we didn't. And that necessitates a fundamental change in how we imagine death and our position in relation to it. Foucault once said that the sick living body is the anticipation of the corpse it will become. But perhaps, though, I think of this sort of idea of the undead as offering us a way of conceptualizing sick life, not as an anticipation, but as already a corpse with new life breathed into it. the end of life is now ambiguous. Death is keenly felt as lived experience, but not as something in an imagined future, rather something we are constantly living through. There is no grim reaper anymore. Death is not external, but exists within a person as the experience of living on. That's sort of where I came from, the idea of the undead as a way of embodying the corpse as a way of life, and sort of politics within that. And today's panel, Jenna, Jane and I will talk about 3 really different kinds of perspectives on undeath, but we'll try to talk about and think through the kind of complex ways of thinking with this figure or with this trope. So I want to introduce the 2 amazing speakers that we're going to be speaking with today. And then each of us will say or speak a little bit about our practices in relation to this idea of the undead. So Genna Gardini is a writer, theatre maker and educator from South Africa. She's awarded a national, she was awarded an ICA National Fellowship in 2016 to work on MS Independent, a project about multiple sclerosis, creative writing. She's been longlisted for the Short Story Day Africa Prize in 2019 for the Fish Tank Crab, and 2017 for Transubstantiation, which was published in ID New Short Fiction from Africa. Jenna's first collection of poems, Matrix Rage, was published by Hulanga in 2015 and commended for the English Yonker Prize in 2016. Jenna won the 2020 CASA Award to complete her play Many Scars, which was developed during her PhD here at Queen Mary. She co-founded the queer theatre collective Horses Heads Productions with Gary Hartley, and her plays Winter Sweet and Scrape won Standard Bank Ovation Awards at the National Arts Festival. Jenna is an international fellow for the Royal Court from 2013 to 14, and has been part of the Mother Tongue Project's Walk, a series of performed responses to violence, to gender violence in South Africa. And Jenna has been working on a new play, which we'll talk about today, in which she writes Saint Lidwina as a character who's both simultaneously dead and alive. And Jenna will talk more about that. And then our other amazing speaker that we have with us today is Jane Wildgoose, who works across a range of disciplines, exploring the values, narratives, and memories that become attached to remains of all kinds, whether it's devising complex cabinets and installations, combining hundreds of museum objects with specifically devised handcrafts, research, writing and designing medical and musical performances based on curious piece of Baroque music describing surgery to remove stones from the body, or co-devising a broadcast for the BBC examining a hair from the head of Horatio Nelson bought on eBay. Wildgoose's appraisals of the past are transported into the present with a strong appeal to the senses, the imagination, and underpinned by detailed research and thorough knowledge of the history of collecting. As the keeper of her own collection, the Wildgoose Memorial Library, she presides over an ever-evolving memory theatre of evocative found and handcrafted objects, documents, photographs and books that take a central place in her practice. She got a PhD from Kingston University and is a visiting senior research fellow in the Centre for Life Writing Research at King's College, and also a founding partner of the Centre for Philosophy and the Visual Arts at King's. And today, Jane's going to talk about working with the remains of the human in her memorial library, and the way in which these might function as a sort of form of the undead. And I'm not going to give my own artist bio, that would be horrible to do, but just to say that I am an artist who works in live art through performance, writing and video, and I explore the politics and philosophies of what it means to be born with a life-shortening illness and to live longer than expected. Some recent work I've done was Until the Last Breath is Breathed, which I showed at here last year, and I'm currently working on a new series of works, which I'm going to talk about later in my little artist section for the ICA in London. So that's my little introduction for today, and I thought that maybe we could hand over to one of our 2 speakers now to start. Jenna, would you like to go first? Amazing. So Jenna's going to talk 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to Jane and me, and then open up to a conversation. Over to you, Jenna.
Okay, cool. Let me know if you can see what I'm sharing on my screen.
Not yet, no.
It's not showing. Let me try again.
Yeah, we have it now, Jenna.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. So I am going to be talking about a character who I'm writing for a play that I'm doing as part of my PhD at Queen Mary. So I am doing a PhD project that's about multiple sclerosis and gender, and I'm writing what's meant to be a semi-autobiographical play, I guess, about my experience of MS. And while I was doing research into the history of MS, especially in terms of women, I found this amazing, amazing person called Ledwina, who is the patron saint of multiple sclerosis and amazingly ice skating as well. She was born in 1380 in Holland, and she was the only girl in a family with 9 brothers, and she didn't like the caretaking responsibilities that were forced upon her when she was a young girl, and often rebelled against them. She knew that she was going to have to get married someday, but she didn't want to. She made a vow of chastity. And when she was told when she was around 13 that she was pretty, she started to pray for a deformity on her face because she didn't want to be attractive. She wanted to be a nun. But when she was 15, her father was seriously considering marrying her off to help the family financially. And it was in that same year that she developed a mysterious illness. But she recovered from that illness and then promptly went ice skating with a group of her friends. And while she was ice skating, she had a terrible accident. In this accident, she broke a bunch of ribs on her right side, and she never recovered from this accident. So she lost her mobility, and she would have like onset of symptoms where she couldn't move at all. There were various symptoms which we can talk a bit more about later, but essentially she would get sick and then get better and then get sick again and then get better. And she was very angry about it at first, but then after 3 years of this, she decided that she was going to dedicate her suffering to the sins of others, that she would be like Christ and suffer for other people. And after she made the decision, then a mythology around her started to grow, and she started to be able to do like miraculous deeds. She had visions where she went into purgatory. She had visions where she was in heaven. She also had visions where she accompanied Christ on his passion. So she was with him while he was going to get crucified as well. And then some of her other, I guess, more popular miraculous deeds were her really long fasts. So she went without eating for the majority of her life, and she existed only on the Eucharist. And also when she was tested by priests who didn't want to give her the Eucharist, she managed to manifest her own out of thin air as well. And then like all of this is obviously fascinating, but what really drew me to her was the fact that many of her miraculous deeds were linked to her existing between life and death. So she was understood to be on the brink of death, if not dead already, but then at the same time also living. So her body would rot, large pieces of her body and her skin would fall off all the time. But her rotting flesh didn't smell bad, it smelled like flowers. It was apparently like really appealing, and people used to come and try to collect bits of it. The like effluvia, the liquid that would come off of her rotting body, had healing properties apparently, and she would use it to heal other people. She didn't like she didn't excrete anything else. She didn't shit. She didn't wee. She would only lactate spontaneously on a special every so often, but that was about it. But otherwise, she was sort of embalmed for the most part. So she died when she was 53 years old. And in the 20th century, her bones were exhumed, then they were analyzed, and then in 1979, she was assessed by a neurologist called Dr. Maeder, and she was posthumously diagnosed with MS. So after that, she became known as the patron saint of MS. But contemporary neurologists have questioned whether or not she actually had MS, and have spoken about her being like a histrionic girl, and the word teenager is used to describe her all the time. And I was really interested in this because during Ledwina's lifetime, teenagers didn't exist. Like, that term was only invented in 1944. So there was no way for her to be what we would now understand to be a teenager. So when Ledwina lived, MS didn't exist, and being a teenage girl didn't exist, but they exist for us now. And I know that I'm probably running over time, but I just want to say that when I was thinking about the medieval in terms of writing my play, I was thinking about what it offered me, and essentially what the medieval and what Edwina offers me is a way to think about illness, and specifically the illness that I guess would now be defined as multiple sclerosis, which is an illness that I have. Thinking about it as miraculous instead of thinking about it as degenerative and tragic, because it was through Ledwina's illness that she was sacred, that she was divine. And this is a completely different way of thinking about illness than what we have today. I guess I'll carry on talking when we do the rest of the discussion.
Amazing. I mean, that's totally gorgeous, Jenna. That's incredible. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Jane, and Jane will talk a little bit about her practice. Jane, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm sharing my screen, and with any luck, there you go. Can you see that okay? I hope you can.
Yes, we can see it beautifully, Jane. Yeah.
Great. Okay, but you can't see me. Okay, absolutely fascinating, both of you. Yes, I'm going to start with a quote, and it's a quote from Lewis Hyde. He's talking about the role of the artist and the way that the role of the artist may intersect with aspects of the trickster. And the trickster, says Lewis Hyde, is the adept who can move between the living and the dead. He is sometimes the guide of souls, carrying the dead into the underworld, or opening the tomb to release them when they must walk among us. And preparing for this talk, I realized that I've been walking among the undead throughout my career, and I thought I'd walk you very quickly with a few selected undead to show you how they have guided me from working in performance to the politics of the dead. And I'm going to start right at the beginning, when I was a student and became captivated by Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. And Martin, I was so fascinated by you talking about your autobiography. And if you want to ask me any questions about why I was interested in Miss Havisham, I'm happy to tell you. Anyway, as a student, I became really fascinated by Dickens' description of her. She is, of course, the famously jilted bride who insists on living in her rotting wedding dress for the rest of her life, surrounded by her rotting wedding breakfast, and this sort of extraordinary metaphor for her psychic and physical deterioration. And the first time we meet her is through the eyes of the young boy Pip, who's been summoned to her house, and he's really horrified by what he sees. He says, "Once I had been taken to see some ghastly waxwork at the fair. Once I had been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress. Now waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me." Miss Havisham is the undead, and I was captivated by her, and I wanted to make a life-size papier-mâché sculpture of her, and I thought I needed to go and look at some dead bodies. Where could I do that legitimately? Well, I found myself in the British Museum in the Egyptian department, drawing the naturally mummified body in the sand. And I'm going to pause here and say that I had a really defining moment there. A tiny seed was planted, which took many years to come to fruition, but I was sitting there really concentrating on this ancient dead body, transported thousands of miles into a culture totally alien from the one in which it had lived, and surrounded by small school children running around and shrieking. And I just thought, what kind of afterlife have we given this dead person? This came into my head, and I went on drawing. And I was drawing from photographs of the mummies in Palermo in Sicily, literally skeletons in the ashes of rich dresses. I was drawing from Renaissance transi tombs. This one, he's up on his feet, he's certainly walking. Is he dissected? Is he just rotting? Is he both? He has his heart in his left hand and he's looking at it. And at around this time, I was introduced to Clive Barker, who would go on to be the horror writer. He was looking for a costume designer for his small theatre company, and he was really interested in these drawings of mine. And we talked quite a lot about our shared interest in anatomical illustration. And it was Clive who introduced me to The Walking Dead of the Renaissance anatomist Andreas Vesalius, who made this famous series of, again, walking corpses strolling in all their dissected glory through a Tuscan landscape. And Clive was captivated by these images and saw them as the ultimate monster, man, undead in all his carnality coming to get you. And of course, he transposed that image into Hellraiser in the person of Frank Cotton, his horror movie. I had nothing to do with that special effects, but I was commissioned by Clive to produce the costumes for 4 undead sadomasochists. I've made a mistake with my caption there, undead sadomasochists in Hellraiser. And I went back to the drawings of Vesalius, to the site of all pain and pleasure, to stylize those drawings and turn them into costumes. I also went back to the British Museum to look at another ancient corpse dragged out of its grave and put under the spotlight, Lindo Man, who would become one of the most popular exhibits at the British Museum in the 1980s. And that was for my materials research, thinking about the kind of leather that I would use for the costumes. I was also given by Clive a great stack of magazines called Piercing Fans International Quarterly. And in the pages of PFIQ, I wasn't looking for visual signs. I was looking for role models. And one of the role models, one of the most important role models out of 2 that I selected was Bob Flanagan, who had multiple sclerosis, who had cystic fibrosis. I know Martin can talk a lot about Bob Flanagan, and it's very interesting that we both have an interest in him. He was really my ultimate role model for thinking about the kind of ritual glamour and the repulsive glamour that Clive certainly asked for in my costuming of the undead sadomasochists from hell in Hellraiser. And as you can see, I was putting together quite an esoteric resource at that time, which would ultimately become the Wildgoose Memorial Library. I was trying to get my hands on anything to do with the dead, the arts, and the body. And increasingly, though, I became interested in the way in which the artist and the dead body were brought together to bring consolation to the grieving. And I became particularly interested in the use of hair jewellery for mourning. This tradition that goes back to the 17th century, right through to the 19th century, when it became phenomenally popular, where people were wearing fragments of the dead and walking through their lives, commemorating people they had lost. And I was commissioned to make a radio program with Gregory Whitehead, who had bought a single hair from the head of Horatio Nelson on eBay. It was only a split end, and he was interested in how this tiny fragment could tell a backstory about an important man. He was also interested in his responsibilities in owning it. And we discovered that when he was dying during the Battle of Trafalgar, he asked for his hair to be cut off and sent to his lover, Emma Hamilton. And you can still see it in the National Maritime Museum 200 years later. And of course, some of it was not there because it was made into jewellery. And I became so interested in hair as a commemorative material that I went to one of the largest collections in the world to learn to work with it. And what we see on the walls here are framed wreaths made out of human hair. They're made by amateurs, not professionals. And every flower is made from the hair of a known individual, with very ingenious ways of being able to identify them. These women were literally weaving together the relationships of family and friends. And of course, as they died, they became very vital commemoratives to them. And in 2006, when I had been steeped in this kind of way of thinking of tiny fragments of the dead being vital to the living, I was commissioned to write a report on the human remains collection at the Natural History Museum, diametrically opposed in my thinking to many of the scientists who were working with human remains, at a time when the Natural History Museum was considering a return of ancestral remains to Tasmania under new legislation, which had described a unique status differentiating human remains from all other collection objects, and identifying that they can be both understood as it were, inanimate objects of study, but also as vital subjects of significance to the living, and taking into account the history of the way in which many human remains in museums were stolen from the colonies. And I stumbled on evidence at that time at the Natural History Museum that the museum had been actively collecting human skulls, stealing them from graves in the colonies largely, for the purposes of what we would now call racial science. And this got under my political skin and became the focus of my PhD, going back to that idea of the unique status of human remains as either objects of study or vital subjects, and looking very deeply into the history of their colonial acquisition, a comparative study of the way in which human skulls were used to objectify for racial science, and human hair was used as a subject for commemoration in late Victorian London. And I didn't present my findings in a brightly lit white cube gallery. I didn't present them in a temperature and humidity controlled museum. I presented them at the Crypt Gallery so that I could open the tomb to release the dead, so that they might walk among us and tell us their stories, down in the earth, in the dank, where there are so many reminders of the 500 people who are buried behind the walls, in that palpable realm of the dead, where I could present my evidence of grave robbing in the colonies for the purposes of racial science in museums, and at the heart of my exhibition, my own piece of hair work, where every flower made out of donated hair commemorates the life of somebody whose skull was stolen from the colonies for the purposes of racial science in a museum in London.
Wow, thank you so much, Jane. I'm sort of buzzing after hearing both of your short presentations there. It's just amazing, amazing work. So my offering, and then it will be short, and then we'll go into a sort of three-way conversation. And what I wanted to do is, rather than talk about things that I've done, and I've often kind of drawn upon the figure of the undead to understand illness, is to talk about something which is upcoming and some work that I'm making at the moment, which is kind of in process, and to read out a score of a kind of imagined performance, and a performance not yet possible. So the thing that I'm working on at the moment is continuing a body of work that considers what it means to live longer than possible, and the idea of a kind of undead time. And that'll take place at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. And that work is something called the Last Breath Society, which I think of as a kind of gathering together of people who have different relationships to life and death, who are thinking about life and death, and who are kind of somehow trying to explore what it means to be living. And particularly, I conceived of this idea of the Last Breath Society as a kind of semi-fictional group of people that might come together way before anything around COVID was even a kind of flicker of our imagination. And of course, I think that idea has completely transformed since then. So I've tried to be responding to it. And as I was working towards this, I got a really interesting invitation to make a piece of performance work through text as part of a project called Impossible Performances. And the idea was that in our inability to be together in spaces, which is something I've been thinking about a lot. With a lung disease like cystic fibrosis, one of the things that we can't do is ever be in the same room as one another. Those of us who have cystic fibrosis, we can't share the same space. And now that same sort of pathology is mapped onto a wider population because of COVID. And one of the things I was thinking about is like, how do we find ways of being together during this time? Anyway, this idea of impossible performances really kind of excited me. And so I was invited to dream up an impossible performance that could maybe only happen through text. And I wanted to read you the score for that performance, which will feature as part of this impossible performance project that will, I think, take place as a kind of publication. The piece is called An Ambulance to the Future, and it's imagining how I will finally become properly undead. So it starts with death. A few years ago, I surpassed the life expectancy for someone with cystic fibrosis. You know that, I've told you that already. So when I was invited to take part in this project and to imagine an impossible performance, I began to think about the logic of the undead as allowing for the possibility of posthumous performance, that is to say, art from beyond the grave, the imagined, impossible, or not yet possible, mapped out here as an attempt at imagining moving from zombie time into zombiehood, the becoming of the undead. I've constantly explored the ways in which death might manifest itself in a life lived with sickness, but here I'm interested in the ways in which art practices might disturb the boundary of life and death, and the possibility for art after, during, as, and through death. This is a proposal for a work that is currently impossible. There are split opinions on the potential for cryonic preservation of corpses in the hope that they could one day be brought back to life, but this text explores the potential of this future technology. I don't know if I believe that it's possible, but this is a work for the future in which I'm brought back to life. It's the score for my becoming undead. The score is broken into 3 parts. 1, death. 2, suspension of time. 3, resurrection. Each stage is speculative, although part 1 does describe the actual practice of cryopreservation, and it's unknown how the 3 parts could actually occur. 1, death. It starts with death. This death is recorded. The last breath is caught on camera. My corpse lays cold and motionless. CF finally got me. Maybe I lived long enough to see my hair turn grey. Maybe I didn't. My death triggers a whole series of practical exercises to prepare my corpse for resurrection. A group of people arrive and begin to work on my corpse. They are Cryonic's emergency assistance team. My body is injected with hairpin and given cardiopulmonary support and cooled in ice by a funeral director. My body is kept on ice and transported by plane to one of the 3 worldwide cryonic centers, 2 in the US and 1 in Russia. At that center, a process called perfusion takes place. All the blood is removed from my body and cryoprotectant agents are added in its place. My body is taken on a board inside an insulation pouch to a cooling unit. Inside this cooling unit, my body is cooled over a period of 5.5 days to minus 196 Celsius. This is the temperature of liquid nitrogen. My body is then moved into the cryostat, which is a long-term storage unit. My body is lowered into the cryostat, filled with liquid nitrogen. This is a process called cryonic preservation. In short, it's the suspension of a corpse in liquid nitrogen to prevent decay, in order that for one day the technology will exist to bring someone back to life. Cryonics UK calls this an ambulance to the future. The overall cost for this whole process is approximately £152,877.38, with an additional annual membership fee of £382.19, only payable during life. 2. Suspension in time. Upon my death, a camera person arrives and documents the entire process of cryonic preservation. This video is edited into a document of my suspension in time. The video is displayed in a gallery or a museum space. Alongside it, a live feed of my corpse in the cryostat. The live feed is also streamed online all day, every day. The process is documented through a series of photographic portraits of my corpse in different parts of the process. These are exhibited alongside the live feed. The bureaucratic and legislative correspondence which goes into making this happen is also available for people to read. 3. Resurrection. It's unclear how exactly the revival process will take place, if at all, but my revival will be televised. People will be able to witness the moment of first breath. People will witness as I open my eyes. People will witness as I look around me as one of the undead. I will learn what year it is. I will learn that all my loved ones and friends are already dead. I will return to my empty house but will not know my neighbours. I will visit the town where I was born and the house I grew up in. I will tell people what it's like to die. I will watch the video of my own death. I will ask if I'm still sick or has there been a cure already. I will march in the streets again. I will try to find love again. I will visit the graves of everyone I have ever known. I will marvel at new technologies. I will build a new life. I will philosophize about life and death. Eventually, I will die again. I will go through this entire process again until eventually I won't. I will die and I will stay dead. Like everyone I know, I will vanish. All of this simply delayed the inevitable. It ends with death. So that is the sort of score that I'm working on for that. This idea of the impossible performance is the becoming of the undead. So that's sort of my contribution in terms of my artist contribution for this. I think now it would be great to come back together with Jane and Jenna, and that we'll have maybe 15 minutes, a conversation between the three of us, and then we'll go to any questions that you've put in the Q&A section. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in. I can see there's one in there already, but please feel free to keep adding questions to that. Great. I think let's start with the three of us. I sort of have a question which sort of relates to all the practices that we had, and Jane kind of mentioned the idea of autobiography at the start of her presentation there. So I kind of wanted to ask you both about it and about the idea of life writing or autobiography or writing from personal experience, or working, not necessarily writing, but working as an artist from personal experience, and so what is in that for you? So either of you can go.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go Jane, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's something I don't usually talk about, and my work is not confessional, but it took me many years to realise that when I was a young woman as a student, the reason that I was so interested in Miss Havisham was that a few weeks after my 17th birthday, I found myself in the role of full-time carer very suddenly, because she'd gone into hospital and come out again, of my mother, who had been consigned to a wheelchair and really could do very little for herself for a long time. And we were living with her father, my grandfather, who was completely blind and in his 80s and had all sorts of connected geriatric problems as well. Both really lovely people who I loved very much indeed. But at the time that my life and my experience was sort of moving into the world of Eros, I was living in the house of Thanatos, and it had a huge impression on me. And I didn't understand when I was drawn to Miss Havisham that it took me years to realise that that's why I was so captivated with that image, and why I have really spent the whole of my career, thinking about, as you said beautifully, I think, the boundaries between life and death, and the permeability between life and death, and of course the fact that we all know that ultimately we are going to die, but we put off that thinking. But when we have experiences that bring it very forcefully into our own lives, and for me it was through those I cared for and loved, not through myself, it does change our relationship with life.
Well, yeah, that's beautiful. Jenna, how about you?
So the way that autobiography has been something I've been thinking about for this project, I think, is particularly I think about theatre that's made about women specifically with chronic illness and women with multiple sclerosis, it's often autobiographical. So the work is autobiographical. It's talking about personal experiences, and it's always done on like a very, very small scale. And then if work is made about multiple sclerosis that isn't written by somebody who has MS, it's usually like a little bit bigger, but bigger in terms of it being like a two-hander. So it'll either be like an autobiographical solo show, or it'll be a two-hander. And I was interested in thinking about why that's the case. Why when we make work about our illness, why the impulse is to have it be quite small. And it's understandable, I guess, logistically, because you know, who's getting the funding, also who has the capacity to be able to put on something huge on like a large scale. But I was about to do this big project with my PhD, so I thought, well, maybe this would be my opportunity to think about what it would mean for me if I do have the capacity and the space and the resources to make something huge. So I've tried to interpret MS into this like 4-act play, and it's an extravaganza. It's quite massive, and it takes place in a purgatorial setting, and it goes into different kinds of worlds, different planes, different temporal planes, geographical planes, and it looks at the idea of what is MS, what does it mean to have MS. And there is a character who's based on me, but I was interested in like exploding this, trying to figure out my thinking about MS and what it means to have it, but on huge terms, because I could.
Yeah. So there's a kind of fictionalizing of yourself in it as well, somehow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Sorry if anybody noticed this, my strange face that looked like I'd just seen one of the undead in my house, but it wasn't. Sadly, it was a mouse. I just saw a mouse run.
What's happened to the mouse? Where's the mouse?
Yeah. Who knows where the mouse is now?
It's a guest star. It's a
cameo. It's with me. I read the other day that made me chuckle, which is the idea of doing things on Zoom is a bit like having a seance.
Yes.
Hello, is anybody there? Is there anybody there? Can you hear me? Moving on, I sort of wanted to, related to that, I wanted to ask you both a little bit about sort of influences and history as well as kind of influence, because it seems, really important in your current project, Jenna, the kind of history of Saint Ludwina, and Jane, in your project, it's filled with these remnants of histories, which is kind of so exciting. So I kind of wanted to ask you about the place of history and working from either historical figures or historical remains as part of your practices, and the sort of maybe the politics or the kind of significance of those in your making processes.
I can go first. Yeah, I was really interested in trying to see what the history of MS looks like, and people who had it before, maybe who I definitely wasn't familiar with. And there's really fascinating lineage of people who've had this disease. But when I found Saint Ludwina, it felt like an interesting like jumping off point. And yeah, like I find her to be a really fascinating character, and also I find the idea of the medieval and thinking about this disease, if it even was this disease in terms of the medieval, really generative, because again, like she could be sacred, she could be divine because she was ill, but it's also complicated. It's really complex because everything during that time period was like there was constant slippage, and that has like so much theatrical potential as well, I think, because it isn't easy to pin it down. And then in terms of what you were saying about relics, Martin, and yeah, and also Jane, what you were saying in your talk, I was thinking about this in terms of Ludwina. So when she was alive, bits of her body, those were the relics. Those were the things that people wanted. Like people desperately wanted just bits of her rotting flesh. There's this amazing story about her wanting her nephew to become ill so that he can become closer to God, and then he mysteriously got sick, but they found like a mug of beer next to her bed that the nephew had been drinking from that was suspiciously sweet smelling. So she was feeding people her rotting flesh. I love her. She's amazing. Yeah, like the things that were understood to be relics during her lifetime and were treasured. Her bones were treasured, and they were buried underneath the chapel in the area where she died. When those were exhumed, their meaning was completely taken away. Then they became medical, right? So then there were things to analyze medically, and within that analysis, there were ways to refute her divine power, to say, well, she was actually a sick girl, then a mentally ill teenage girl. So different ways of interpreting her, what was understood to be her divine powers during her lifetime. Yeah, so Jenny, that was making me think about like the meanings of taking people's bones. Obviously, it's a very different context.
No. I think we're absolutely kind of, again, there are permeable boundaries here. And when you were talking about the fact that, that her body was rotting, but that it smelt of flowers. I've been making notes, and I made a note of that because it really reminded me of the bones of the saints, of bodies of people, martyrs who were sanctified, and there is always this thing about the fact that they haven't decomposed, and that they often smelt of flowers, and that it was kind of, one of the, I mean, you will know about this because you're far more of a medievalist than I will ever be, but that certainly came into my mind, and I think it would be great to share some stuff. I've done quite a lot of research into relics and their significance. I'd be really happy to share some things with you.
I'd love that.
I'm really pleased to meet you, both of you. They're just such amazing interconnections.
Amazing, yeah, totally beautiful work, stunning work. But I was also thinking about something that came up in yours, Jane, that obviously is totally close to my heart, that absolutely relates to Jen as well, which is Bob Flanagan, and the sort of history of that I've had working with Cherie Rose, who is his partner, and also a 10-year collaboration that Cherie and I have had now since 2011. We made work. First contact, we were in contact with one another from about 2010. I got in touch with her sort of to talk about that. So, in short, Bob and Cherie had a full-time BDSM relationship in which Bob was Cherie's full-time slave, and they also made various kinds of art practices, including performance, video, sculpture, and writing, that came out of that experience, where they used pain and BDSM in order to explore sort of politics of love, of illness, and consent. Consent. And I think, consent. I think Cherie is actually here right now in the thing. Hey, Cherie, I think you're here. We can't see you, but we think you're here. Your name is on the list.
Wow.
We love you. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking is something that Cherie and I have been doing for the last few years, which was actually the idea of Cherie and another artist in LA, Jeffrey Valens, which is the St. Bob Flanagan BDSM Chapel, which is the kind of faux religion that Cherie created, where I sort of take on the kind of Christ figure, that tongue-in-cheek Christ figure. And we've done a series of...
She popped up.
Oh, she popped up. Yeah, we love you, Cherie. So we kind of take on recreating elements from the work they did, and also creating new sort of performances inspired by her relationship, in which really we kind of like think through the legacies of illness and artists making work with illness, particularly with cystic fibrosis. And I kind of become a undead version of Bob in some ways, become the kind of stand-in for him.
Wow.
We've created 2 performances which they didn't manage to realise because Bob died before they were able to realise them. So they kind of planned these 2 works that were unrealised. So that's kind of one of the things we've done. But this idea of the chapel and working with the relics and the elements of BDSM equipment that she used on him, that she then kind of brings forward and uses on me as a sort of way of honouring that history of sickness.
This is a total aside, but part of my library, there's a room here which is dedicated to Victorian mourning. It's my sitting room, and it's known as the Chapel of Rest because somebody once brought his boyfriend here for supper, and at the time I used to serve supper in that room, and the boyfriend, who was quite a new boyfriend and had never met me before, just sent me a postcard afterwards saying thank you for the rest in the chapel on Sunday. So the idea of the chapel, yeah, runs through both our work as well, but in very different ways.
Amazing. We have quite a few questions coming in first, but Jane, do you take visitors to your memorial library / house?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
We all have to go.
You're all welcome. Maybe
yeah.
when we're allowed, maybe we should do a group visit. And you're very, very welcome. Yeah, certainly.
Please, yeah, brilliant. Shall I go to, we only have 15 minutes left, so shall I go to the questions from the audience and then we can fill in if there aren't enough. Great, so, well, there's long questions, okay. Kat, hey Kat fellow. Kat asks, thank you all, or she says, thank you all for such extraordinary provocations and insights into your practice. Fascinating. I was struck by the role of commemoration or even preservation in all 3 of your practices, and wondered if you could each say more about how you see your work, either as a playwright, performance artist, curator, designer, but also as researcher, as participating or not in acts of commemoration.
I'd be happy to go on that one.
Great, go for it, Jane. Yeah.
So yeah, the work that I've been doing most recently with human hair is absolutely a work of commemoration, and actually this ties in with the previous question about history as well. I think a lot of my practice, I look to historical precedents, and certainly the experience of going to America and learning to work with human hair in parallel with the research that I was doing into it, both primary and secondary, was really, really important. And one of the things that I thought about a lot was the kind of living quality of human hair, particularly when people were sending it to me. And yes, so using a tradition, and very particularly, actually, one of the things I really wanted to do with that project was to place the idea of how human skulls have been objectified for racial science, to place that argument within the context of our own traditions, not trying to be the white middle-class person who explained other people's beliefs in a rather patronizing way, but actually to put the argument within an understanding that we all have of our own very long traditions of commemoration, and of commemoration where fragments of the human body are vital clues and memorials to the dead amongst the living. So yes, commemoration is hugely important to that work, and informs a lot of what I do.
Amazing. Anything to say on commemoration from you, Jenna? No worries, if not, we can move on.
Yeah, I think that that some of the work that I'm doing with this play like ties into commemoration, but I guess what I'm quite interested in doing, especially with these historical characters, with all the characters in general, is looking at commemorating and celebrating the ways in which people with MS are complex. So often, you know, we're framed in very simplistic ways, and I wasn't particularly interested in looking at that. Like since we're talking about Ludwina, she's somebody who I'm trying to look at from lots of different perspectives. So I write her as a medieval woman, but then I also write her as like a a contemporary teenage girl, like sort of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer type person.
Yeah, the original prototype.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about yeah, I guess I'm commemorating her in some ways, but I'm also thinking about how she can be interpreted and what her legacy means, and also like the different ways that a person here, a woman with a disease we now call MS, can be. She can be a shithead, or she can be amazing, miraculous, or she can be all of those things. But she's complex.
Yeah. Actually, a sort of point that relates to that is something in the chat that Cherie's put. I think it says to me, talk about the viewing. Yeah. So the viewing, which, you know, in a way really relates to this idea of commemoration, because it's a piece of work that Bob and Cherie had sort of thought of a trilogy of death works as Bob was about to die, and only made the first one. But the third one of those was supposed to be a posthumous performance in which Bob would be buried with a camera in his coffin, filming his face, and that would send the image through to a TV screen in a gallery or somewhere, and people would be able to come in, and if they wanted to, they would turn on the television and look at Bob's face as it decomposes in the coffin. And the piece was never realized. It died before the kind of logistics of that could be fully realized. But our kind of way of addressing that piece we did in Liverpool, actually, as part of Dada Fest, a Disability Arts Festival. And it was a 24-hour performance. Of course, we couldn't really create that, but Cherie had the idea that she wanted to kind of create a piece of work that somehow stood in for that or redressed that, in which I lay in a coffin for 24 hours. On the hour, every hour, Cherie would arrive with another artist who was assistant, Rhiannon Aarons. And they would arrive on the hour every hour to perform a kind of death or mourning ritual or BDSM, through kind of BDSM and pain practices on my body. And the audience were in a separate space to us, watching this through CCTV camera. So it was live, and we were in the room sort of next door almost, but they were not sharing the same space. So they were still watching the performance through CCTV and through the kind of video camera, in which there was one focused on the face, one on the chest, one I think was a wider shot, and one on the scrotum maybe, which are the kind of areas that Cherie was focusing on. Sorry, that mouse is back and it's really sort of distracting me as I speak. I can hear it scratching.
Oh no! I'm sorry, Mark.
So genius.
So the you know, in a way, the viewing was not just simply an act of commemoration, but was also this sort of like reliving, re-embodying of history, and the kind of becoming of the undead, and a celebration. I love, Jenna, in your practice where you talked about your kind of love of Lidwina because of the idea that sickness made her sacred. And I guess for me, I've been thinking like in the lines that the undead somehow figure rescues the idea of the sick person as the victim and instead becomes this other thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. We have loads of questions coming in now. We won't have time to get through them all. Sorry if we don't get to your question. Okay, there's one from Lewis. It's very long, so I won't read it all out, but you can see it there. And essentially, I think Lewis, hey Lewis, this question is around the idea of how does one achieve an automortography? I suppose an obituary acts as a mortography. What happens when we create an automortography? So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that idea of the automortography.
I think that's what you were just talking about.
I think so, yeah. It is, you're right, actually. Yeah.
The question already, really.
Yeah, we've answered it. Great, amazing. Oh, that's okay, Lewis. We'll move on then. Louise, hey Louise. Louise asks or says, with all the talk of imagination and interest in shifting between life and death, the slippage between them, inhuman, ? Relationship to time and such like, I find myself wondering if any of you have thought through the uncanny in relation to your practice. I can say something.
Yeah, very much
yeah.
so. sorry. Yeah, it's very much so, and it's definitely something that that I'm continuing to think about, and specifically in terms of Lidwina. I've been thinking a lot about Brecht, as Aoife, who's my supervisor, knows. So I think trying to understand the uncanny in terms of Lidwina's history, and then also how does that, how can we see that within my writing, but then also within the staging of the play, and then how that can function as a way of like distancing the audience so that people will think about what they're seeing instead of like crying sick lady story. Like actually think about what's on stage. I don't know if that's completely an answer, but essentially to say yes, it's definitely something that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I suppose I haven't thought specifically about it, but there's writing about the idea of the zombie as a kind of, or the undead as an uncanny figure. If the uncanny, and you know, Mark Fisher's idea that the uncanny kind of no, I got lost in my thoughts. Sorry, I'm getting confused here. But there is some writing about the zombie as a kind of uncanny figure in that it kind of reminds us of both death and life, and that that's existing together. But I can't say I've done much thinking of it beyond that, really. Anything from you, Jen, or should we move to the next?
No, other people tend to talk about the uncanny in relation to what I do, but it's not somewhere I've really chosen to look.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
how I don't really have anything to contribute on that. I'm sorry.
Right. Toby, hey Toby. Toby says, thank you all for such a generous and fascinating discussion. Jenna, in writing about Edwina, I think it's Lidwina though, do you feel you are conducting an exhumation of sorts? If so, is your impulse to venerate, analyze, desecrate, or all three? Love that question.
Toby. It's such a good question. I don't know that it's that I'm performing an exhumation. Maybe she's exhuming me. She's certainly bringing up a lot of my past stuff around Catholicism. I was raised Catholic, so yeah, maybe she's exhuming those ideas. I don't know. Like I guess in terms of venerating her or desecrating her, analyzing her, I'm sort of, I guess maybe all of those things, but also at the same time, I'm sure that the Lidwina that I'm writing is completely different to who she actually was, and I mean she's very much a projection of the things that that I need from this character, but it's something that I'm taking from her, and maybe it's a veneration, maybe it's a sin, I don't know, is all of the really interesting, slippery, messy ways in which she existed in the medieval period, in which she was archived, how she was written about, how she was understood, the things that I interpret as rebellion, which maybe are not rebellions at all, against various patriarchal systems, and then how she continues to push back against patriarchal systems even today. Because she was always getting into shit with priests and getting into shit with like civic but like, and now, even now, like doctors, mostly dude doctors, are still getting, you know, like very wound up about her. And I don't know that she was necessarily purposefully doing that. I like the idea that she was, but it certainly serves my purposes to think about how that could have been an option, or that could have been like a motivation for her. She, yeah, she provokes me more than anything. I guess she does more to me than I do to her, is probably the best answer. Thanks, Toby.
Amazing, thanks Jenna. We're getting some lovely comments in the chat and in the Q&A about mice and about giggling, which is nice, and you know, some really nice things. I'm not going to read them out. We have a couple more questions. We might not have time to answer them both, but we'll see. So the next question, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, is George. George says, I was really fascinated by all three of the short presentations. Thank you so much for sharing your work. One of the things I'm really enjoying already with the discussions we're having is the expansion of the notion of the undead, undeath, and how it can function rhetorically and even theatrically in different contexts. I'm wondering whether in your work, your exploration of these ideas have rubbed up against the ideas of zombie or the undead, which have been popularized by Gothic media, post-Romero, horror film, etc. Have you found yourselves having to resist preconceptions and assumptions in that regard, or have you found those popular cultural representations of the undead useful for your work in any way? Hope that makes sense. And sorry it's so long. It makes beautiful sense.
Yeah.
Jenna or Jane, do you want to go?
I think I would say that I think this really relates to the question about history, actually, that I'd always much rather look at history. And it sort of makes me realize that when I was doing the costuming all those years ago for Hellraiser, actually the last thing that I wanted to look at was contemporary popular culture. And in fact, I think I really like locating, I'm very interested in archetypal thinking. So I'm always interested in looking to the past to see how similar motifs and ideas translate into new contexts, rather than looking at what's actually happening at the moment. So that's probably a very negative response to your question, but it's an honest one. And yeah, I think the other thing that was very important actually in terms of popular iconography was actually getting away from the classic black leather SM look, which obviously Hellraiser buys into to a certain extent, but I very deliberately, although in the films it does look quite dark, I used a kind of distressed brown leather that was like the Lindo Man, and really again was not looking, was looking at Bob, was looking at Fakir, was looking at people who were really, you know, living their experience and creating their own rituals, rather than, I suppose, looking from the inside rather than what I see as kind of skimming on popular culture, which is very much taking something from the outside.
Beautiful. Jenna, anything from you on this?
Yeah, like I was mentioning Buffy the Vampire Slayer earlier, and that I'm very serious about that. I presented at a Buffy conference like 2 years ago. When I started to research Ludwina and was reading more about her, she was reminding me so much of Buffy. Just the idea of this girl who was understood to be attractive during her lifetime, and like there are some excerpts or like some accounts of things that Ludwina said that I think are like quite snarky, even though they maybe weren't read like that. There were just little hints of her as a person that I think like got past her hagiographers, that it was reminding me of Buffy, the idea of this girl being invested with these supernatural powers. And I wanted to draw a line between them because, like, I love Buffy. Like, I'm a big Buffy fan. Obviously, fuck Joss Whedon, a piece of shit. But I love Buffy quite a lot. And so I wanted to draw those connections, but then at the same time, I wanted to think about it in terms of the medieval. So the film that I'm writing, Act 4 of the play, is a medieval miracle play, and I'm trying to adhere to that. The formula of that, the structure of it, and the ways in which those plays venerated women saints, and how they did it, like theatrically, but also formally within the writing. So I'm trying to balance the two, like my interest in pop culture now, but also a very new interest in the medieval, and seeing the ways in which they meld. And I mean, Buffy is like extremely Catholic in terms of its iconography, and it draws from the medieval in many ways. So again, slippage.
Yeah, amazing. I'm also a big Buffy buff, but I'd say for me, I've really drawn very explicitly from those kind of images of pop cultural undead figures. And for example, one of my projects was a film, a short 30-minute film in collaboration with a filmmaker I often work with, Sahil Merchant. We made a video called The Unwell, and it was shot in Coventry over 5 nights from 1 a.m. till 6 a.m. Each night. And Coventry is a kind of amazing city in that nobody really seems to live in the centre. So at the end of the day, people kind of leave the centre and it becomes empty. So we would just go around there and we didn't see anybody during those hours. And we shot where I was dressed in these sort of really bad DIY sort of B-movie style zombie costumes. And walking around, we've done all the, you know, special effects makeup myself, so it was quite bad. And sort of walking through, and then the film, which you can see on my website if you want to, it's kind of me narrating this text about the idea of a city where only the unwell exist. And these figures, we never call them zombies, we just call them the unwell, which has kind of strange, staggering, coughing bodies. And it's just me walking through the streets coughing, spitting mucus, pissing. So it's kind of leaking bodies around the city, and it's almost like a sort of documentary, really, a poetic documentary of these figures that just stumble and amble through the urban wasteland, which is one of the lines from it. And then other performances as well have drawn upon those sort of tropes. I'm speaking quickly because we're already 1 minute over. There is another question, and I'm sorry, Steve, we don't have time to answer your question, Steve D. It is a great question. You can see in the Q&A there, and please, anybody, feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to talk more about this kind of thing. I'm always open to conversations, and I can pass details on to Jane and Jenna as well if they're happy for that to happen.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Jane, gorgeous. Thank you, Jenna, gorgeous. It was so amazing. I could speak to you all night. And just to remind everybody, I'm posting in the chat there a link to the conversation series that's ongoing. And big thanks to Molly McPhee and to Aoife Monks, who've curated this whole series so beautifully. Please feel free to come to any more of these that we're doing. They start again at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning, and with a series of different talks all through the day tomorrow, and then on Friday as well. There's so much going on. As I said, there's stuff on boxing, stuff on teeth, and a range of other things too as well. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's beautiful to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good night, everybody. Stay undead.
We'll do our best.